All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world watching this. And what we're going to do today, folks, is there's a really important thing I want you to understand about the way that society is, okay? And, I want you to understand human beings as reactions to things going on around them. If you can remember that humans are reactions to things going on around them and how humans are inherently, we are these machines, these animals that crave order and predictability. If you can understand that, then you're on the road to some good understanding here. Okay, that seems kind of redundant. But anyways, so what we're going to do, guys, is we're going to talk about the classical era, right? When we're talking about the classical era, we're going back in time, okay? And what we're going to do is we will look at the classical conservative era and the classical liberal era. And then later on, we're going to talk about modern interpretations of what liberalism means and what conservatism means. And we'll get there. We're not at that point yet in this course, but we need to understand why society is organized the way that it is now in the world. We need to understand where we've come from. So we're going to go back about 1500 years in history to the year 500, and then we'll change gears and we'll talk about the classical liberal era, and then from that we can endeavor to talk about classical conservative and classical liberal philosophers who are very important to social studies 30. Okay, so guys, society again is just basically reactions to things going on at that time. So understanding that, let's talk about the classical conservative era. Okay, so first of all, guys, the classical conservative era is synonymous, right? It is also known as the so-called Dark Ages, and we'll talk about that when we look at this idea of the Enlightenment. So it's sometimes called the Dark Ages, or even the medieval or the feudal period. And when I think of the Dark Ages, the medieval or the feudal period, I think of, men on horses, knights, kings, large kingdoms that had walls around them. I think of the way society back in the day used to be organized. Now, guys, the classical or this idea of, feudalism was really the first attempt at organizing society in sort of the last maybe 1500 to 2000 years, okay? So, yes, I realize that there were empires way back in the day, right? Like the Mayans, the Roman Empire, etc. But really, those empires aren't that much different than the way that classical conservative society was organized. So with that being said, guys, let's try to understand what's going on here. So the classical conservative era, humans at this time, your average person was incredibly ignorant. To be ignorant means to not know. Now, why didn't we know? Well, there were no books. There was no internet. You didn't have Google, right? So knowledge at this time was a very sacred thing. It wasn't until the printing press of the 1400s do we see knowledge being mass produced in the form of books, which eventually leads to people learning how to read, and then knowledge explodes at that time. But we're not at that point. We're saying this is the 500s, right? And people on average were very ignorant, right? And as a result, guys, because of our collective ignorance at this time, humans really didn't know what to believe. There was no system of knowledge called science that existed. So humans were incredibly in the dark, which is why at this time it was also known as the Dark Ages. We were ignorant. And because of our ignorance, the world was unpredictable and chaotic. People didn't understand at this time that, there was a rational and reasonable explanation for basically everything that goes on in the world, okay? Humans used to believe that the earth was the center of our universe, right? And in fact, that was proven to be false because we know through science that it is the sun, which is the center of our universe. People used to believe that, this thing that we today called lightning was God's wrath. God must be angry. Volcanoes, oh, why are those happening, right? Earthquakes, it was always quite often, either an unexplainable phenomenon that we just weren't sure about, or it was attributed to God's wrath, right? And because of that ignorance, people were superstitious, and people were fearful. People were generally fearful. But along comes these individuals called kings, called emperors, who, as long as you submitted to their authority, would provide you with protection from the unpredictable, chaotic world. And guys, that seemed better. To submit to a king seemed like a better alternative, and to live in a kingdom where society was at least semi-organized and there was like protections and things like that, that seemed like a better way to go about life than to live in this world where, life was very chaotic and unpredictable, right? Plagues couldn't be explained. Again, we thought it was God's wrath. And instead, science figures out that, things like the bubonic plague was caused by, fleas, right? Which were carried by rats and stuff like that. Like, just understand, folks, that the classical conservative era, when we go back to these days, was just this world where man toiled and woman toiled and child toiled. And when you had the offer from, these individuals claiming to be representatives of God, right? These people called kings who believed in this theory called the divine right of kings, then, who are you to question God, right? So you submitted to their authority. So at this time, guys, we get two really big thinkers. One by the name of Thomas Hobbes and the other by the name of Edmund Burke. And you can see their names right here. Burke and Hobbes become advocates for that sort of feudal organization of society where it was like a triangle, right? You had a few individuals up top who had all the power, and then everyone else underneath, basically their role was to follow and to do as they are told. So because people were ignorant, because it was believed that man was flawed and irrational. When you're irrational, it means you're not really sure why you do what you do. You don't act in a rational manner. You're not acting based upon knowledge. You're acting upon something else. When you combine the ignorance, the superstition, our flawed nature, and our irrationality, then submitting to a king or an emperor seemed like a better way to go, right? And eventually, guys, this idea of the divine right of kings becomes the ideological basis for authoritarian government. Government back in the classical conservative era was authoritarian, meaning you had one person with total authority. It was totalitarian, meaning you had someone with total authority. It was autocratic instead of democratic, meaning, again, you had one person who was totally in power, and your job was to listen. Your job was not to question, right? And in exchange for your obedience, you got the protection of your king. So the role of government at this time was to provide order and stability in order to avoid chaos. And we'll talk about, guys, this chaos when we talk about Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes said in the so-called state of nature, before autocratic government, before kings and emperors, life was solitary, so you're alone. It was poor, meaning not good, nasty, obviously not great, brutish, right? You're subjected to violence, and short. You're going to die quickly. And then, guys, the role of the individual was basically to submit to authority, to listen to your king, to give them your allegiance. Your job is to not question the king. Okay, just give me a sec here. I just need a drink. All right, so I know what you're thinking. Wow, Mr. Crosby, that sounds terrible. And I mean, guys, compared to the so-called state of nature, which we'll talk about when we look at Thomas Hobbes, compared to this unpredictable, chaotic world that was totally disorganized, no, in fact, submitting to a king and living in a kingdom where there's order and hierarchy fed that human need for predictability in society, and it worked for a long time until it doesn't. And where do we start to see cracks in classical conservative theory? Well, two really important things happen in the world. the first thing that's important is called the Renaissance. So the second important thing that happens was known as the Enlightenment, and we see this here in this chart. So let's talk about the Renaissance first. So the Renaissance, about the year 1500, and the Renaissance originally, guys, began in Italy. The word Renaissance is a term that means the rebirth. The rebirth of what? The rebirth of curiosity. Humans during the Renaissance became curious. We started to ask the question, why? And from this question of why, we devised this system of knowledge called science. So earlier on, I talked about this thing called, like, this phenomenon of lightning, right? People used to believe that lightning was God's wrath. And people eventually during the Renaissance start to ask the question, well, is that true? Why does lightning happen? And they eventually figure out through science this method of knowledge, right? We conduct experiments, we manipulate a variable, there's a dependent variable, and from that we can make hypotheses, we can make theories in terms of why things happen, right? And science really, guys, is the pursuit of truth, right? Science is the pursuit of truth. So through science, we in fact discover that lightning is not God's wrath. Lightning, in fact, is a static discharge caused by particle movement in clouds. As particles rub together in clouds, right, there's a buildup of static, and eventually that static is discharged, and that discharge is called lightning, right? If you take, a balloon and rub it on your head, right, you will see that in the dark where static is formed, right? If you're wearing a certain type of shirt, especially here in Canada in the winter, right, I sleep usually with a shirt that's kind of like almost like a spandexy type of material. When I take that shirt off at night, if the lights are out, there's all sorts of static that is caused by that shirt rubbing against my body, and then boom, that static is discharged. I mean, that's like lightning, right? So we now understand, static, all these things. So that, guys, was the Renaissance. Now, from the Renaissance, a couple hundred years down the road, in around the 1700s, we see this thing called the Enlightenment. And again, if you remember, the classical conservative feudal era was called the Dark Ages, right? From the darkness, we move to the light. With science in the middle, figuring out why things happen, we go from being ignorant in the dark, in the classical conservative area, to now being in the light, to being enlightened. Now people understand a lot more about the natural world. The earth has been disproven as this idea of being the center of the universe. Now we understand it as the sun. We now understand why when we let things go, such as this can of delicious sparkling water flavored lime drink that I have here, right? We understand now that when you let it go, it goes towards the earth because of this thing called gravity. We understand that large masses have this attractive force called gravity, which is why, for instance, the sun has a lot more gravity than the earth. We discover all this stuff through science. Now we're enlightened. Now we know stuff. It's crazy, right? And guys, here's the thing to understand. People during the Enlightenment started to say, well, wait a minute, if all these things that we assumed were true about the natural world were in fact proven false by science, and now we know so much more, maybe, just maybe, the way society is organized under kings and emperors and monarchs, maybe that in fact is false as well. Maybe in fact kings, emperors, monarchs, maybe they're just greedy jerks who want all the power for themselves while we have nothing. And from this idea, guys, eventually humans become radicalized. Humans start to question the order and nature of authority. And from classical liberal thought, right, this orientation towards freedom, we get two really important revolutions. The first one is the American Revolution. Rah, rah, America. Guys, in 1776, the first great experiment in classical liberal thought, rejecting classical conservative thought, happens in America. Guys, the American Revolution is basically a middle finger, to put it lightly, to monarchy, to feudalism, to classical liberal divine right of king thinking. And from the American Revolution in 1776, we get the French Revolution 13 years later in 1789. And, you know, historically speaking, guys, I would argue that the American Revolution was more important than the French Revolution. But if you took Social Studies 20 here in Alberta, chances are you spent a heck of a lot of time on the French Revolution and probably not as much time on the American Revolution. And the question is, why? And I would argue that that was because, you know, guys, Europe, you know, in the 1700s was really sort of the intellectual hub of the world. What was going on across the pond in America with those upstart Americans fighting against their king? It was important, but really, guys, it was the French who were rejecting, with the French Revolution, hundreds of years of Bourbon rule, right? Hundreds of years of monarchy in that country. And that really, guys, rocked the way people thought about society, the way people thought about authority, and the way things can be organized. So, guys, classical liberalism embraces this idea of freedom. No longer am I just a lowly peasant growing up in France or Great Britain. Now I'm an individual who has rights which are bestowed upon me not by government, but by God. Right, guys? And these rights that we're talking about are these things called natural rights. The right to life, liberty, and property. These rights, according to classical liberal philosophers, are unalienable. If something is unalienable, it means it cannot be taken away. So these unalienable rights to life, liberty, and property aren't given to you by a king, but they're given to you by something greater. And the fathers of the American state, right? The people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, James Madison, etc. They said that these natural rights were given to us by God, right? And if God giveth, no man can taketh away. Kind of a different way of thinking, right? Back in the classical conservative era, you were given rights by your king, and that was it. The king was the representative of God on earth. Now, these classical liberal philosophers say that, in fact, no, rights are just inherent in your humanity. So it's a totally different way of thinking about the nature and the structure of power. So, yeah, guys, these natural rights, life, liberty, property, become really, really important. And the classical liberal philosophy, instead of believing in absolute totalitarian authoritarian government, they believe in limited government. Right? And what limits government at this time? Well, these things called constitutions. Really, guys, classical liberalism is the first great experiment in this idea of individualism. How you as an individual have rights that are not secondary to anybody else, but they're equal to everyone. So this belief in limited government, guys, really becomes the catalyst for the American Revolution, because they're rejecting total government. King George of Great Britain had total domain over the American 13 colonies, but eventually, because of taxation, these individuals in the American 13 colonies say enough is enough. We need limited government. We need individual rights. And today, guys, this idea of small limited government becomes what we today assume to be known as the Libertarian Philosophy. So if you believe in small limited government today, you're generally thought of as being a libertarian. So they believe in limited government, and economically speaking, guys, they believe in this idea of laissez faire, which I'm pretty certain we talked about before in a previous video, but if we haven't, here's a little introduction to it, or alternatively, if we have, here's a reminder about what it believes. So laissez faire means let it be. It means leave it alone. And guys, laissez faire means government doesn't get involved in the economy. It means that society believes in capitalism. It believes in profit motive. It believes in self-interest. It believes in this idea of the invisible hand to guide the economy. It's not government guiding the economy. It's not you being subservient to it. It's you looking out for yourself, making a product or a service, right? And this really is just capitalism in a nutshell, right? It's you making a product or service that other people see value in, that then they will pay you for, that then provides for you, right? you create a product or service that people buy, they win because they get said product or service that makes them happy and fulfills their needs and wants. You, as a capitalist, as an entrepreneur, you get money. So it's this mutual exchange of value that we see in capitalism that really, guys, is the economics of classical liberalism, right? So limited government, politically speaking, and laissez-faire capitalism, economically speaking. Back in the classical conservative era, you had total government rather than limited government, and you had people who were subservient, economically speaking, to their king. You were to work for the king to provide for the kingdom, right? You didn't really provide that much for yourself. You might be able to keep a little bit, but you were trying to enhance the kingdom. Now, guys, in the classical liberal era, who are you trying to enhance? Well, you're trying to enhance yourself, right? You're doing what you do to provide for you, not for a king and for his glorious court, but for you. Okay. Now, guys, when we get to the birth of modern liberalism with FDR and the New Deal, we will talk about this modern liberalism and this neoconservatism coming up later, okay? So yeah, if you have questions, comments, not sure about something as far as classical conservatism and classical liberalism are concerned, let me know. Fire me an email and we can address this, okay? So anyways, that is that. Talk to you guys later. I love you. Keep on keeping on. Yeah, man, keep having that brain in between your ears growing. Okay, I love you guys. Peace.